All right, guys. Good morning, good afternoon. Let's get going with today's topic, the end of Reconstruction. This is a fascinating topic to me, as we'll get to when we get to the end of the lecture. I think we see some particularly ill fated political decisions. The crux of today's lecture is going to culminate with the Compromise of 1877, which I think is going to go down in my mind forever as the single worst political decision in American history. Um, we start with the end of Andrew Johnson's presidency. Now, he does not get removed from office due to impeachment, but he is the first president to become impeached. He does not get convicted of impeachment. The story of what he is impeached for surrounds the violation of the Office of Tenure Act. It's pretty much neither here nor there. Uh, it amounts to the fact that Johnson is incredibly unpopular from a political standpoint. In the long run, you can make the argument that his acquittal emboldens Southern Democrats, that they think they can kind of get away with what he did. They can get away with what he stands for, which, as he put it in his own words, is the preservation of the South as the white man's country. Okay. In the short term, it does lead to, along with the congressional override of Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it does lead to the transition from this chapter of presidential reconstruction to congressional reconstruction, um, which is an entirely different ball game. Okay, but that's kind of a little bit more short term, because as we're going to see, the net effect at the end of the day is that the South will be preserved as white man's country, as it were. Um, Born during Reconstruction is the Ku Klux Klan. Uh, I know we've all heard of it. It is, for all intents and purposes, just it's a domestic terrorist organization of white supremacists, designed and born during Reconstruction to keep the black vote out of Southern politics and to return redemption to Southern Democrats and to restore home rule for Southern Democrats. And as we will see, it's successful in using its violence and fear of violence in keeping the black man from participating in politics. It's one of the darker chapters of American history is this era of Reconstruction, where the South largely ignores the guidance and the will of the federal government, and essentially finds those creative means we talked about via black codes to override the U.S. Constitution. It ushers in, along with that Compromise of 1877, what we know as the Jim Crow era of segregation. And I don't think we can get out of Reconstruction without recognizing, uh, sadly, the important role that the Ku Klux Klan plays in preserving the South as white man's country. I've got a video linked here for you on this type and on this picture. I'd like you to take a couple minutes to watch that now, and then we'll continue with our lecture. Okay, so when Johnson finishes out Lincoln's term, he's virtually unelectable for reelection. He's replaced by the Civil War general Ulysses S. Grant. No political experience, but a Civil War hero and a Republican. He ushers in a period of what we could call strong government or heavy reconstruction. It's presidential in a sense, although Grant is really kind of working hand in glove with those quote unquote radical Republicans in Congress. Um, Grant is known for using his military force to, for a short time at least, to crush that KKK, to use Northern troops to maintain order in the South. Remember that in the transition from presidential to congressional Reconstruction, Congress had divided the South into military districts, okay, rather than accepting either Lincoln's nor Johnson's plan for readmission of those states, especially in light of the fact that the South was using means like the KKK and the Black Codes to essentially ignore the rule of law and constitutional law at that. So Grant is the perfect partner with his military experience to install the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 and oversee this period of heavy or hard or strong government reconstruction. He certainly, I think, does a good job of kind of stabilizing the nation, of overseeing that most exemplary, although admittedly brief, shining moment of racial equity in the South. He's the president when we pass the 15th Amendment. He's the president when the 15th Amendment is at its strongest until the end of Jim Crow era segregation, some 80 years later. Um, and he's the president when we see not only equity, but we see significant representation of African Americans in Congress and state governments. Guys like Hiram reveals. Take a look at the pictures of the Mississippi State Legislature during this time, and it is kind of mind blowing to consider what we witnessed during this brief window during Grant's presidency. Um, he had some other successes as well, perhaps most notably Seward's Folly, William Seward being Grant's Secretary of State during his terms. And William Seward negotiates the purchase of Alaska from Russia for just $7.2 million. It was derisively known as Seward's Folly at the time because it seemed like this kind of uh, remote, worthless wasteland of frozen tundra. It goes down, of course, as having incredible value in terms of natural resources and so on. And so Grant has a number of successes as president of the United States. He probably would have gone down as a wonderful president of the United States if he hadn't been among the single most corrupt presidents in U.S. history. In fact, it wasn't just him, it was like his entire administration. All of his political appointments engaged in grift, if you will. Perhaps most notably among these scandals, and one that you need to know about, is the Credit Mobile scandal. The Credit Mobile is a railroad construction company that, yes, skims large profits off the government, but engages in some serious political grift in doing so. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's notable that I think, speaking to some of his other successes and his popularity, particularly up north and among Southern African American Republicans that are, still in the game, so to speak, that Grant wins re-election, um, but he's plagued by this Credit Mobile scandal throughout all of his second term, and that's really kind of probably what forces him more than anything else to continue following the two-term precedent set first by George Washington and maintained by other presidents since. The Credit Mobile scandal is pretty fascinating. Um, they are the federal government that is as we know, completing the transcontinental railroad. There's incredible money to be made in these railroad contracts um, through government funding, and construction companies are bidding on doing this work. Only one company, the Credit Mobile company, really seems to get any of these contracts. And they're getting them at let's say, not fair market value. They are consistently the highest bidder. What they're doing with those contracts essentially is then giving straight up bags of cash or stock to the very congressmen and political appointments and presidential cabinet members, perhaps Grant himself, for ensuring that they were awarded the contracts in the first place. It's also fascinating. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we focus back on the railroads. That when you look at how these railroads are constructed, these firms like Credit Mobile are being paid by the mile. We all know that the straightest distance between 2 points is, or the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That is typically not how these railroads are constructed. They're weaving in and out, and in an effort to maximize the value of their contracts and the revenue received and the revenue therefore redistributed to corrupt politicians. So Grant is very much plagued by the Credit Mobile scandal, and that kind of puts him out of office. It's generally speaking, we're talking about the 1860s into the 1870s. It's a period of widespread corruption following the Civil War in the United States, as we're building the railroads, as we are reconstructing, in that literal sense, the American South, and a lot of money to be made, a lot of contracts to be handed out in the South. And as the American city, particularly up north, is greatly expanding, politics are an incredibly corrupt business throughout all of the 1860s, and really for a good turn until kind of the progressive era reforms that we're going to get in the early 1900s. The story of Boss Tweed is incredibly notable among the stories of corruption. William M. Tweed, or Boss Tweed, is the head of Tammany Hall, which is what we call a political machine that controls New York City. So, what we mean by a political machine is, in order to run for office, um, these political machines are essentially kind of the kingmakers. They decide who will or will not run for office, or who will or will not get elected to office. They are essentially controlling the money, they are controlling the vote, and they're doing so through not too much less than can be characterized as kind of organized crime in their corruption and fraud involving taxpayer money. One particular example of this is the construction of the New York City courthouse as it pertains to Boss Tweed. Okay, the cost of construction is only $3 million. The company that wins the contract and performs the work charges taxpayers $13 million, and essentially takes 10 million of it and distributes it to Boss Tweed and the Tweed Ring, and they distribute it to the politicians that they are ensuring their election and getting into office, and therefore, again, cycling through the policies that the political machine wants to see passed. There is a political cartoonist of note here by the name of Thomas Nast. We've seen some of Thomas Nast's work before, but Thomas Nast becomes famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, for how successfully he exposes the corruption of the Tweed Ring. He really drives, when we talk about, primary document analysis and we talk about purpose. Well, the purpose of Thomas Nast's work is to drive public opinion as it pertains to shining a light on the political corruption that takes place in New York City. You see a couple of his famous works here. Okay, this one over here called "Under the Thumb," where you see on the cuff link is William M. Tweed, and he's got New York City under its thumb. He controls all of New York City through his Tweed Ring. The boss saying here, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And here in this next one, here's Big Boss Tweed. saying, as long as I control the votes, what are you going to do about it? There's virtually nothing that can be done about the vast and widespread corruption that we're seeing, particularly in American politics and the American city around this time during the mid to really kind of late 1800s. And it's a story worth noting for how it's going to play out with the rest of kind of the American economy, the American political scene for really kind of the next 20, 30, 40 years. A certain New York politician, by the way, comes onto the scene during this time playing the role of reformer. He takes on Boss Tweed and he challenges him and he helps to harness that spirit that was put out there by Thomas Nassett's cartoon, and helps to put, to bag Boss Tweed, as it were. All right, that is Samuel J. Tilden, is the politician known for quote unquote bagging Boss Tweed. Pay attention to that name because it's going to become very important in American politics shortly enough. This is how Samuel Tilden, a future presidential candidate, rises to the scene. Um, all of this is taking place, by the way, behind the backdrop of a the Panic of 1873, which we've used that term before, right? A panic, which essentially implies an economic, at least a recession or a depression, or very much a panic in the people for the direction of the United States economy, faith in the economy, faith in the banking system, and so on. And the Panic of 1873, in and of itself, um, would just be another one of those stories of these, kind of cyclical periods of economic depression, but for its timing, coming about here in the latter half of Grant's presidency, um, and the latter half of this heavy period of Reconstruction. And the Panic of 73, in those terms, becomes incredibly important. The story behind it, right, is that there's a large banking firm which can't meet the debts that it files. It files for bankruptcy. And it sets off this financial panic of kind of like a run on the banks, right? And other small banks who are tied into this big bank, they can't meet their debts and they close, they go out of business. When banks go out of business, people lose their money. Mind you, we're not in, the never mind the progressive era reforms, but some of the institutions that we see take place following the Great Depression, like the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where we know today as retail bankers, right, that our funds are protected, that there's shouldn't probably be any more, as long as we have, any modicum of faith in our government, a run on the banks, because our money is protected by the government in those institutions. That's not the case here. And so these small banks go out of business. When the big banks go out of business, when all those banks go out of business, people lose their money. The stock market collapses. Companies go out of business. Again, we're kind of dealing with one of the side issues, okay, is this idea of a greenback or a specie. Congress in 1875 had decided to use a specie to back the money. We know that when we looked at that before, the specie circular, right, that limits the money supply, limits economic opportunity for particularly those who need it most. So the Panic of 1873 sets off a chain of events for 4, 5, 6 years where the economy is really kind of in a fairly significant tailspin. I wouldn't categorize it nearly as bad as that with which we are most familiar, the Great Depression, but it's probably not all that far off either. And again, the reason that this is important is because it comes at a time when the South and the Democrats in the South are really pushing hard against this kind of hard, heavy government, strong period of Reconstruction, and which requires an incredible amount of investment from the union, from the federal government. Okay, and at that, kind of socially, in light of the rise of the KKK and the black codes, which are effectively serving to dismantle all of the political efforts that the Republicans are making in the South anyway, they become wary. They become tired. They're tired of the resistance. They're tired of the expense of Reconstruction, this reinvestment into the South, a South that doesn't want them when the economy is going to ruins. Okay, and so the Democrats are beginning to gain control of Southern governments, and the Northerners, the Republicans, are becoming tired of it all. The Democrats view this as redemption, that they are taking back the South for themselves. Okay. Um, Behind this backdrop, Grant, though he's a hardline Reconstructionist, he's got an economy that's faltering. He's got scandal. So he's not going to run for a third term, as we mentioned before. Um, and, the economy will dictate that, so will scandal. Uh, Perhaps Grant might have had a shot had it not been for the scandal, but the economy in and of itself might have been difficult to overcome. Nevertheless, we're seeing this effort towards redemption in the South, and we're seeing the Republicans and the Northerners just growing weary and tired and exhausted of the reconstructive efforts. So Grant pulls out of the picture, and we have the election of 1876 following Grant's two terms, which lead to the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Samuel J. Tilden. Now, Tilden is a Northerner, but he's a Democrat. Um, and so we have an opportunity here to witness significant political change in the election of 1876. Uh, Tilden actually wins the popular vote, but he fails to gain a majority of electors. And so the election of 1876 goes to a special electoral commission built by Congress. Um, I want you to pause the video here in a second, and I want you to read the link that I've provided. It's several pages to the American pageant textbook that gets into this Hayes Tilden standoff of 1876 and gets into, again, what I've been building up to here for some time, the Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. This is going to provide some really good background for you to include in your class notes. We should know by now who Samuel J. Tilden was, how he rose to fame. Okay. And this is going to bring you a little bit more into the dispute behind the Electoral College and how this crisis was resolved. But most importantly, what I want to continue class with in a moment is what was the result of the compromise, both immediate and long term. So please take what time you need to read through these pages, these sections of your textbook, and take the appropriate notes. Okay. So the Compromise of 1877, I think, is what officially brings an end to the period of Reconstruction. We have a cartoon here that I want to take a closer look at that compares these periods of Reconstruction. Um, I think you will see from a certain point of view. So we have over here in the first panel the strong government, as it were, 1869 to 1877. Of course, that is during Grant's presidency, who we know is a hardline constructionist. Okay. And then we have, well, essentially the abandonment of Reconstruction, the weak government, 1877 to 1881, That would be under the presidency. Now we know who the next president is after reading in our textbook. That is Rutherford B. Hayes. I want you to take a look before cheating and going to the next slide to see what you can pick out from these political cartoons that tell us a little bit more about their point of view. So, what you're going to see, right, is that in the under the rule of the strong government, we have the solid South is being crushed, right, by carpet bag and bayonet rule. Bayonet rule being the military force employed by the radical Republicans in Congress, along with their president, right, Ulysses S. Grant, um, along with those carpetbaggers, those damn Yankees, right? Um, and if we look at some other elements here in this cartoon, we see that the South is in ruins as long as the North is trying to force its will upon the South. So clearly, I think we're looking at, especially when you look at this second panel, the Southern point of view about Reconstruction policy. When we get to the end of Reconstruction through the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, um, Hayes kind of placates Southern Democrats um, by doing nothing about Reconstruction. You see it here on his plow. It's called the "Let Him Alone" policy. Okay, he is burying the bloody shirt of hardline Reconstruction. He's burying bayonet rule. And by the Southern perspective, now in the background, you see the South is rising again, right? We see rather than sinking ships on the left, you see the ships are representing industry and factories are functioning well. Agriculture is back. You see probably what is probably a former slaveholder giving instructions or orders to a sharecropper or a tenant farmer who appears to be, at least from the shading here, black and probably a former slave. But the implication is, right, that the South is so much more prosperous and better off without Reconstruction. Now, given your reading, you know that this is the deal with the devil that Rutherford B. Hayes and the Republican Party were willing to make in order to secure the presidency, right? Give us the presidency and we're going to let them alone. We're going to demilitarize the South. We're going to remove the bayonet rule. Okay. We're going to allow for, again, Southern redemption, Southern home rule, the Southern way of life. You can read more about some other analysis here on your slides as well. Okay. Um, what we see here is sometimes called the corrupt bargain, but that's probably more uh, commonly used when we talk about John Quincy Adams making Henry Clay his Secretary of State, right? In exchange for Clay ensuring that that JQA becomes president. The Compromise of 1877 is again when the Republicans say, "Hey, listen, we're going to abandon the policies of Reconstruction as long as we just get the presidential office again, we get the White House again." Again, the North is tired from the expense, tired from the resistance. They're fearful of losing all federal power, and so they just give up. They give in, and the shame of it is, right, is that the result of giving up on the notion of Reconstruction, you've got to blame in part, well, the economy, that kind of it is what it is, but you got to blame Grant for his corruption. Um, Without that, maybe he could have served the third term. Maybe America could have witnessed some greater successes from the reconstructive period. But when the Republican Party abandons Reconstruction to take the White House as a part of the Compromise of 1877, what we see is that period of Jim Crow rule ushered in. KKK, public lynchings, a civil rights battle that has yet to really be resolved. Certainly, when we get to further time periods and JFK and LBJ and the Civil Rights Act and the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s, we see some improvement. But if the past couple of years have taught us anything, we're not quite there yet. And it's amazing to think about where we could have gone if we had never had to live really fully through this period of Jim Crow era segregation. Jim Crow era segregation is fully cemented with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896. So, this is a Supreme Court decision that will stand, stare decisis, let the decision stand, as the rule of America for the next 58 years until it's finally overturned by the much better adjudicated decision we see in Brown v. Board of Education out of Topeka, Kansas. So this decision comes down to the fact that there's an African American that sues for the fact that he is not allowed on a whites only train car because he has some black blood in him, and uh, and the Supreme Court makes the decision that racial segregation is perfectly constitutional so long as the different facilities by race are quote unquote separate but equal. What we know, right, over the next, you know, 100 years is that the impact of Jim Crow and Plessy v. Ferguson is very difficult to overemphasize. Separate is inherently unequal. You can see it related here to car trains. The clearly the power structure would dictate that the nice car trains belong to the whites, and that the Jim Crow car, as it were. By the way, Jim Crow is the name where this comes from, is a fictional blackface character in theater around the time. But the Jim Crow car or the black car is going to receive less funding, just like uh, black schools go on for the next 60, 70 years to receive less funding. You see it, ushered in here with, a water fountain, but we could pull up any number of issues of how disparate the facilities are between Black America and white America. And it's because of this Jim Crow era segregation that lasts for decades, right? Uh, as being constitutional because of the Plessy v. Ferguson case. We see it in the images that are in front of us when we look at, the colored waiting rooms, when we look at the whites only lunch counters, when we talked about the images surrounding, Franklin McCain and the Greensboro Four from NCA&T at the lunch counter sit-ins. So Plessy v. Ferguson, in my mind's eye, is probably the most poorly adjudicated Supreme Court decision in U.S. history. And it comes about as a direct result of the federal government's abandonment of Reconstruction policies just to hold on to the White House for 4 years, which is a part of the Compromise of 1877. Okay. And all of that, 100 years of shame, violence, uh, domestic terrorism, just to hold on to political power for 4 years. So, that, my friends, is my TED talk on why the Compromise of 1877 is the single worst decision in American political history, because the exchange was made, hey, give us the White House for 4 years, and we are going to let an entire nation of people be suppressed, not just politically, okay, which is important enough, perhaps more importantly, economically, and of course, through the means of violence and through, again, just uh, inexplicably poor uh, jurisprudence as it relates to Plessy v. Ferguson and subsequent cases that come along as well. So, Compromise of 1877, know it, the single worst decision in American political history. But it does bring us to, for the intent of moving along in our subject matter here, the end of Reconstruction. So, we've got our Reconstruction guide timeline here, right? First, we've got Lincoln. Lincoln is no longer with us, right? And then we bring in Andrew Johnson and then Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln was going to be incredibly lenient on the South with his 10% plan. Uh, Johnson was going to insist upon the 13th Amendment and all that, but he was going to bring in former Confederates. Johnson was, as we know, an unabashed racist seeking the return of the South to white man's country. Grant is the president that perhaps most notably oversees this chapter, this brief and shining moment of equality in American politics, of stemming the violence of the KKK, but his corruption, along with the really bad coincidental timing of this financial panic of 1873 brings an end to his tenure in office. And the Compromise of 1877 then brings an end to Reconstruction and ushers in the Jim Crow era, uh, dark chapter in American history. So again, we want to be able to explain what is Reconstruction, what time period does it include, who were these presidents and what were their policies. We've got to know the constitutional amendments that were passed 13, 14, 15, the Civil War amendments, right? What is the difference between congressional and presidential Reconstruction? Who are the radical Republicans? What did they do to advance their agenda along with Ulysses S. Grant? Because radical Republicans necessarily refers to those in Congress. Okay. And then how did the South go about achieving redemption, restoring home rule? What creative, if evil, means did they employ to overcome? The what would otherwise be and is now today, unconstitutional means like the black codes, the poll taxes, the literacy tests, and so on. There's a whole host of terms here that we need to know, right? The carpetbaggers, the scallywags. So we should be able to get into all of this work, and we should be able to look at a cartoon like Thomas Nast's here again on Slavery is Dead and be able to interpret this kind of work. If you're paying attention to all the details here, right, we're seeing again kind of a two-panel piece of work. Negroes sold as punishment for crimes. This is post-slavery, mind you, post-Emancipation Proclamation. This is 1866 under the guise of states' rights. Lady Justice, turning a blind eye to the whipping of African Americans for committing crimes as smiling white folk look along. Okay. There's this period of Reconstruction that is not reconstructive at all, leads to this Jim Crow era, uh, allows for incredible violence and racism to take place. This is Thomas Nast's famous work, Slavery is Dead? Question mark. Um, there's a little bit more of a description here that I should think you should pay attention to. It would not shock me for you to see some analysis required on works like this, either from me or this is such a famous piece of work, along with the strong government, weak government piece. These are the most notable political cartoons to come out of this era, and they stick with us here in American history. So I would ask you to study these images, both of them, and read both descriptions as well and get to know this work. All of these terms by now should be in your notes. All right, you should be able to have an intelligent conversation on those guiding questions we talked about just a few slides ago, and incorporate the importance and the impact of all of these terms and acts and people, policies, as they relate to both Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction. Remember, we've got some homework here as well with your ed puzzle and your actively learn. And we should walk out of these two classes and these two assignments and the notes that I'm asking you to take with a really good understanding now, guys, of what we're talking about when it comes to Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction. We'll look forward